Working as a breaker boy was punishing work, yet the boys hollered jokes and curses back and forth among themselves in language more fitting for a grown man, and during their 2 rare work breaks, scuffled and chased with one another in jollity over the coal piles. Breaker boys learned quickly not to make mistakes in the breakers. Mistakes cost money. Their meager wages, usually 60 cents a day, wouldn't support a family, but they helped when added to the wages of their fathers, who were drivers, laborers, and the most prized position of all, miners. Some prize. Miners took their lives in their hands every day, carefully drilling into a breast of coal, placing blasting caps into holes they had bored, and detonating them, always with a muttered prayer that the vein would open up to reveal its riches rather than bringing timbers down to crush the lives from all of them. It was true that miners labored shorter hours, being paid by the carload. When the breast was exploited sufficiently to fill the allotted cars, the miners were free to go home, leaving in the capable hands of their laborers the back-breaking work of loading the coal onto the cars and turning it over to the drivers. It was this shorter day which generated the fiction that miners had a special job, and why breaker boys, trapper boys, and laborers alike all looked forward to that glorious day when they could be certified as miners. It was also true that laborers worked physically much harder, loading the cars, a task which took many hours and paid only half what the miner made. But the laborers knew that it was only through years of conscientiously serving their miner buddy that they would qualify to take the legendary certification test for the prized job of miner. Consequently, they slaved over the piles of loosened coal, picking it up, placing it in cars, and helping the drivers to direct the mules up the dangerous slopes. Many unfortunate laborers who, turning their backs too soon, found themselves minus a limb, were crushed to death beneath the wheels of the car, which wasn't properly hooked to the preceding one by the laborers. Teamwork wasn't a luxury in the mines. It was a matter of survival. For 3 years, Bud worked the breaker quickly and efficiently, earning the notice of the breaker boys. All breaker boys worked hard, but few did their jobs silently and as diligently as Bud did. Still only 15, Bud's diligence paid off, and the breaker boss recommended he be moved to the position of trapper, a job which paid much more and caused less physical pain. In the fall of 1898, Bud Neely moved from a social job, albeit a physically agonizing job, to a mentally agonizing one. Now his day was spent standing or sitting in the dark bowels of the mine for hours on end, with only his tin cap lamp and a book for company. Working the ventilator shaft door, waiting as the cars, pulled by stupid, hard-working mules, approached the door to the shaft, opening and closing the doors so as to lose no time, and sparing the precious life-saving air, which was blown in by massive fans placed in vertical shafts overhead. As a trapper, Bud rarely saw his old friends from the breaker, rarely exchanged words with another human. The older drivers were often broken-spirited, and even the younger drivers, not much older than Bud, knew it was in their best interest to appear to be all business. So they passed by him with only a brief nod. It was a solitary life, but a safer one than the ones which awaited on the other side of the doors. For 2 years he served as trapper boy. Bud learned to find solace and stimulation in books. Even though his eyes watered and his head ached from attempting to read in the near dark, with only the flickering flame of a miner's tap light, his mind expanded with each book he finished. Although neither his da nor his granda could read, his gentle mother loved to read aloud, read the Bible, read anything she could get her hands on, and taught Bud and his 2 sisters to read and enjoy books. By lantern light, after the weary and ailing da had fallen into a deep stupor, the 3 Neely children traveled in their imaginations to faraway ports, embarking on adventure after adventure, Irish folk tales, fairy tales, first mesmerized by the soft, hypnotic sound of their mother's voice as she read the tales to them, then later, as Aidan grew sicker and their worried mother cared for him, the children took turns reading aloud as best they could until sleep overtook them. Years later, alone in the dark, squinting at the tiny pinpoint of light from his cap light, Bud thanked God and his mother for the gifts he'd been given, the ability to read and the gift of desire to know more about life than the walls and pillars of the damp and moldy mines could ever provide. For 2 years, Bud passed his time at the doors, jumping to attention when the rumble of the returning coal cars approached, then returning to his private world. When Bud was 17, as a new century dawned, a rumor traveled quickly through the mines of a second large coal discovery in southeastern Ohio in a town named Bucktown. These mines were run by a man, one John R. Bucktown, who was, legend had it, quite unlike other mine owners, a kind man who had made tremendous efforts to create safer mines and better working conditions. John Bucktown had opened a store, even, which was operated at a minimal profit, offering prices to the miners and their families equal to what they would pay in nearby towns. This was unheard of. The company's store was notorious for robbing the miners, even though such exploitation was illegal. As the story of this new mine and its owner traveled by word of mouth, the reputation of his owner took on the proportion of a Santa Claus. A smart man, Bud knew the way of folklore in and around the mines, unreliable. Nevertheless, during the miners' strike of 1897, many older miners and laborers had migrated to Ohio looking for work, and the news of their success and prosperity had trickled back to the mines in Pennsylvania. The prospect of travel had always fascinated Bud, and he discovered that day that, God willing, he would like to head west. Man of the family, though, from the age of 8, Bud knew he could never leave his family with no source of support. Yet again, God had a plan for Bud. In 1902, Bud's mother, Elaine, married a widowed farmer she had met in church. A taciturn man, his new stepfather, Bud found it awkward when his mother and sisters moved to the farm. This seemed to be a message to him when he was released, somewhat at least, from his role as sole provider. Packing everything he owned into 2 large satchels that sunny day of early autumn 1902, extracting promises from his sisters to be good for their mother and not to cry at his leaving, he kissed them goodbye. Bud shook hands with his somber stepfather, wished his weeping mother farewell, and boarded the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad heading west into Ohio. He had never been farther than 5 miles from the company home in which he was born. As the train rattled through the Allegheny Mountains, just turning vivid with fall's paintbrush, the young miner's eyes were wide with the wonder of the world outside a coal mine. He was going away from the only home he'd ever known, and although his heart occasionally caught in trepidation, it beat faster at the life he was about to make. Night fell before the hypnotic clickety-clackety-clap of the train's wheels began to slow a bit, then a bit more, until with a hearty blast of the whistle, the C&O came to a clumsy stop in front of a long, low station house in Nelsonville, Ohio. Standing and gratefully stretching his cramped legs, Bud grabbed his smaller satchel from the overhead bin and moved to the door, peering right and left, up and down the track, trying to see the typical southeastern Ohio warm weather evening fog. And finally, with his larger satchel over his shoulder, he realized for the first time the enormity of the step he had taken. He was completely alone for the first time in his life in a strange place. He squinted to see the walls of the mighty Hockton Valley Canal, which ran parallel to the tracks, sitting idle now at midnight, but one of the busiest canals in Ohio during the day, or so Bud had heard. The fog made him strangely claustrophobic. Trees looked like they were advancing and retreating, a ghostly sight, and the air felt sparse and stifling. Crossing himself as he stepped away from the station, he realized he had no idea where he was going. Turning back to the station master, he asked in his lilty Irish way, "Yo, mister, would you be knowing a place I could get a room for the night?" Nodding over his shoulder, the master replied, "Yep, over yonder, see that light? That's the Dew House," which is still there, by the way. It's about a half mile up that there road. They've got some single rooms that don't go too dear, I heard, and went back to his magazine. Looking the way the master had nodded, Bud's eyes could barely make out a light shimmering eerily in the fog. Used to fog in Pennsylvania, still, this fog seemed almost thick enough to slice. It was disconcerting. "Thank you, sir," Bud said with the tip of his cap, and ignoring the sense of apprehension caused both by the fog and the unfamiliarity of his surroundings, the young man set off walking toward the light. "Lord, help me find this hotel before I fall in the canal and drown," he prayed, hoping he wasn't drawing his last breaths. Through the grace of God and his own determination, after about 15 minutes, Bud nearly walked smack into the columns of the Dew House porch before he realized he had arrived. Just putting one foot in front of the other, looking ahead at nothing but soggy gray, an occasional flicker of yellow light. Sighing with relief and wiping the moisture, part fog and part sweat, from his face, Bud entered the cheery hotel, the first one he'd ever been in his short life. Made his way to the desk where the desk clerk was dozing, fitful snores escaping from under his huge mustache. The lobby, with its cherry furnishings and cut crystal gaslight lamps, looked so elegant to Bud that he was momentarily afraid that he couldn't afford to stay. But fatigue won out, and he woke the clerk to inquire about a single room. Giving 50 cents for a sleeping room for just one night, a dear price, the adventurer realized he would have to make his way to Bookdale and find cheaper lodging really soon, or he would be sleeping on the ground. The young miner from Pennsylvania couldn't resist looking around this grand place, despite his fatigue, and he wandered up and down the upper hall, his eyes wide. He ran his fingertips over flocked wallpaper, peering out over the balcony at the lobby below, thinking to himself how much he wished his mother and sisters could be seeing this incredible place. That thought suddenly making him very homesick. Not fond of his mother's new husband, Bud had to acknowledge that he had mixed feelings about this adventure. Elaine appeared happy, however, and the girls were treated well, so his worries seemed pointless. Besides, his room was cozy, the bed was comfortable, and after washing up at the washstand, nibbling on a bit of beef jerky, and saying his prayers, young Bud Neely, in his new surroundings, slept the sleep of the innocent heart, knowing somehow his God would provide. Bud makes well, as you can imagine, in the mines, marries a shopkeeper's daughter, and they begin a family, along with the family of Markhams, who are modeled after my grandparents, who are merchants. And the remainder of the novel develops Bud's life with his family and the Markhams as they're developing a merchandising empire.